Welcome to the Vernuccio Novak Report and the American Political Zone. From New York, this is Frank Vernuccio.
And from Washington, this is Daria Novak.
And from China, we're about to see one of our, or perhaps our most severe enemy, now will have the world's, if not today, then certainly within a quick amount of time. Daria, this adds, of course, to the fact that China also has the world's largest navy at this point, the world's largest land force, and of course, Russia, our rather good friend, now has the world's largest, or has had the world's largest nuclear force since the Obama administration cut ours back. We are in deep trouble. And what is more worrisome, I think, is that to a large segment of the American public, and certainly to the left-wing media, these facts simply are not being discussed at all. Again, if you look at the entirety of the American armed force, it has been reduced in size since the Biden administration took over. We have stopped supporting our key ally in the Middle East, Israel. We have moved to strengthen our worst enemy in that area of the world, Iran. We've given up a secure base that could have been self-supporting in terms of defense for many decades to come, Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan, which now is run by the Chinese. We have let military-age young men into the country over our southern border. We have let suspected terrorists into the country on our southern border. Daria, the question you got to ask, and we'll talk more about the Chinese Air Force in context, but does this administration have even the slightest notion of national security?
It concerns me that they don't. They're globalists. They would like to see the United States become not a leader in the world, but a middling power. And what we see is the Biden administration playing with data points. And I think this is really important for our audience to understand. When we talk about things like national security and defense budgets, we have to recognize that our numbers include different items in those numbers than those of other countries. So where the Biden administration is telling us, oh, we have to worry about China a little, but it's not overly concerning. They're overlooking some of the facts, Frank. Right now, you'll see the Biden administration say, oh, we don't have to worry about the numbers of ships that much because US tonnage of military ships is twice that of China. But the reality is, okay, we might have large ships, but they can't be everywhere. We need to look at the numbers of what's included. If the United States is including drones, then we should be comparing those budget numbers to countries that are also including military drones, what they call MCAPs, of military unarmed vehicles, hypersonic, for instance, in China's case. We ought to be looking at those included against our included numbers. We don't get those from China. We don't know how many drones they have at this point. So when we're talking about China approaching being the largest air force in the world, Frank, they may have already exceeded the US capacity, not only for what is in stock, but for the rate of production of these vehicles. We have no way at this point of tracing that. So, one of my concerns is that, as you and I have talked about on air, it takes a long time to fill the pipeline for the military, much longer than it does for Russia or China or Iran or even North Korea. We need to be thinking long term, and that requires an administration that recognizes there are people and governments and groups out there that are unfriendly or even antithetical to the American way of life. I don't think this administration gets it.
No, I don't think so at all. And part of the administration's argument for a smaller force is that, well, we have perhaps more tonnage, we have more automation. But this argument of quality over quantity is not a new one. Let's just go back to the middle of the last century. German weaponry, the tanks they had, the airplanes they had, were in many cases dramatically better, in some cases a generation ahead of what the Allies had. But as we found out, it was the quantity that beat out over quality. There's numerous discussions, if you are into military vehicle history, that the Sherman tank used by the Allied forces was not anywhere near the capabilities of the German tanks. And yet, eventually, the sheer number of American tanks, the sheer number of weapons produced by American manufacturers was able to outclass and outfight the very good, perhaps even superior individual German units. And yet that lesson is still not being learned.
You know, Frank, you're so right. Here's another factor that we really need to consider. If we look at the total number of planes that the United States is building, for example, the F 35, we're building hundreds of these planes. However, we are giving to other nations many of these aircraft and only keeping 75 for the United States military. So when we see large numbers, we also have to deduct out where we are helping allies, other countries like Ukraine, places that can't afford them. So we're not necessarily even getting the money back, which we can put into production again. This is really something that we are doing as leader of the free world and that we need to take into account. But when you see enemies of those who do not support our military, you see them quoting all these high numbers. It's just not the reality. You and I've talked about also the fact that if you look at real dollar terms, we are not keeping up with where we were a few years ago. And that is concerning when other nations, once again, that are either unfriendly or our enemies, are increasing their military budgets and increasing production. This past year alone in China, the two particular aircraft production facilities, Shenyang and Xiaoyong, I believe it was, both increased production, and they're preparing to do even more in the future. So the rate of production of those countries that will be potentially going to war with the United States in the future are producing more while we're sitting back. We're going to be playing catch up before pretty long.
And the difference between, say, today and 1941 is that the weapons that the United States has going into a conflict are pretty much all we're going to have. We don't have the industrial capacity to rebuild a fleet, to build vast numbers of tanks, planes, guns for a war once it starts. I want to point out how vulnerable the American infrastructure is. First of all, it's dramatically smaller than it was, barely a fraction of what it was in previous wars, particularly 1941. But more than that, we've just seen an example of how vulnerable American infrastructure is. We've seen over the past couple of years attacks, cyber attacks on American electrical facilities. We've seen attempted cyber attacks on our water facilities. And just this past week, we saw it. Now, I don't believe it was an act of terrorism. There's no evidence for that, but it is an example of vulnerability, how one ship can pretty much knock out the port of Baltimore pretty effectively. Now, you take that as an example, and you look at our electrical facilities, our tiny manufacturing capacity compared to what it was in the past, and how easy it is to shut down a major port. And I think you get the idea that if we were in a conflict with an enemy determined to attack, we are only going to have the weapons we have right now. We're not going to be able to build into it in a coming conflict.
You know, Frank, there are ripple effects too, as you mentioned, from Baltimore. Right now, they've stopped, as far as I know, all reclamation processes because they found a high pressure pipeline underneath. I'm assuming it's natural gas. It's too dangerous right now to do any work in that region. What's happened is companies are trying to redirect their shipping. This is impacting Americans across the country. In redirecting shipping, Maersk, the major shipping company, has said that unless a shipment is in process, they won't accept it at another port. These type of implications will go on and ripple for a long time.
Daria, let's go to our first guest, Rainer Zitelmann. We welcome him back to the show. He is one of Germany's capitalist superstars. He's a philosopher and author of a book, How Nations Escape Poverty, Vietnam, Poland, and the Origins of Prosperity. Rainer, welcome to the program.
Hello. Well, great to hear you. Thank you for inviting me. Can you see me
It
well?
is great to be with you again. You know, Germany has been an economic superstar over the years. We've seen its economy become one of the greatest in the world. And yet it seems that actions taken by the German government and the German politics have seemed to attack the stability of the great German economy, whether it's in energy production, and in many other ways. Why is the nation apparently turning in on itself in terms of its economic capability?
Yes, I agree. And I see you are well informed about the situation here in Europe and especially in Germany. The reason is that for a couple of years, since the time of Angela Merkel, we go more and more in the direction of a planned economy. I give you one example. First, we phased out nuclear power plants. Then we phased out coal power plants. Then we forbid fracking. And now we have to import fracking gas, LNG, from the United States, what is, of course, good for the United States, but crazy to forbid it in Germany and then to import it. And we have to import electricity from nuclear power plants in France or from dirty coal power plants in Eastern Europe, because the Green Party, that is very influential here, they think they can do all with windmills and with the sun, but it's not so sunny in Germany. So this was the first thing. The next thing is they want now from Brussels to forbid combustion engines. So no one should be allowed to buy a car with a combustion engine, but only electric vehicles. This is the next crazy idea, because, you know, we were very proud in Germany for our Mercedes, BMW, Volkswagen. But I think it's the first time that a nation voluntarily destroys their best products because of this green ideology in the fight against climate change. These are all crazy ideas, ideology driven. And on the other hand, we do not spend enough for our defense. You see it now that without the help for the United States, we cannot survive, because since years and years, we spend not enough. A lot of American presidents criticized this, but we give a lot of money for crazy things that they call development aid, billions and billions all over the world to save the world against from climate change and all this stuff. So it's very crazy what we are doing here.
It's not only in the industrial capacity. I understand throughout Europe that farmers are revolting against regulations that the government is putting on them. I think we can all agree that eating is a good thing. And yet we see from lunatic ideas in Ireland, for example, where they're killing off their cattle because the cattle apparently breathe and digest and produce gas, that they want to kill animals, not to eat, but to just simply destroy the herds.
Yes, this is absolutely crazy. And let's bring it to the point. What is the difference between capitalism, a free market economy on the one hand, and socialism, a planned economy on the other hand? It's very easy to understand. In a free market economy, entrepreneurs decide what to produce. For example, Mercedes make the decision what cars are good and what not. In the end, it's the consumer's choice. They buy the BMW or not. They buy the Mercedes or not. This is capitalism. In a planned economy, politicians and government officials, they decide what to produce because they think that they are smarter than everyone else. They think they are smarter than millions of entrepreneurs, millions of consumers. Of course, we know it's not true that the politicians are smarter than everyone else. But this is exactly what they believe. And this is what planned economy means. And we go more and more in Europe, but I think also in the United States, with Joe Biden, with his policies, we go more and more in the direction of a planned economy. Maybe they don't call it a planned economy, but in reality, this is a planned economy.
And of course, in the United States, we're facing the ludicrous situation where the Biden administration is trying to force EVs, electric vehicles, not only on consumers, but on trucking companies as well. The car manufacturers don't want to make them. The car retailers don't want to sell them. The car consumers and truck consumers don't want to buy them. That's pretty universal. And yet the administration demands through regulation and legislative fiat that we go to a electric car system. And of course, the logic that if you plugged those electric cars in, you would outstrip the electrical capacity of the entire nation doesn't seem to phase their logic at all. How does this collective insanity from one end of the planet to the other just seem to take hold on us?
Yes, this is a negative development because, I remember in the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, when after the collapse of socialism, almost everyone understood in the world that capitalism is a better system and socialism does not work. But now it's some decades ago, and we have a revival of socialist ideas almost everywhere in the world. In the last 20 months, I visited 30 countries in Asia, in Africa, in Asia, in the United States, of course, in Europe, and in Latin America. And my new book now, we want to talk about it, How Nations Escape Poverty. It's about two examples that capitalism is much better than socialism. I don't believe so much in theories. I'm an historian, and I believe in, visiting countries and do my research, and then I see what works and what not. And here are the two countries. The first one is Poland. In the 80s, Poland was one of the poorest countries in Europe in socialist times. They were even poorer than the Ukraine, and the GDP per capita was only half of the Czech Republic. An average Pole earned $50 a month at this time. $50 a month. They were very, very poor. They had to stand in long queues, in long rows. Sometimes they had to wait hours or even days to get something. And even if they don't need it, they buy it to exchange it with someone else. This was the reality. I have a lot of examples in my book, How Nations Escape Poverty. And then they started in 1990 with free market reforms. There was a very smart professor for economics who believes in the teachings of Hayek and Mises. His name was Balcerowicz, and he started with capitalist reforms. And now, since 3 decades, Poland is Europe's growth champion and one of the fastest growing countries in the world. If you go there, and I think I've been there 10 times in the last 2 years, you see, it's amazing how everything changed. Now, this is one example. The other example in my book is a surprise maybe for a lot of people, and I think this is especially interesting for Americans who are older. May I ask, what is your age? I'm 66.
I'm 60.
I'm 71.
What? 71. So you remember, well, I think you were too young to fight in Vietnam, or have you been in Vietnam? No,
I wasn't in Vietnam, but I certainly remember the war.
You remember the war. And it was about capitalism or communism, all this thing. So we are in the same generation, we remember. The funny thing now is we know that in the end, the communists won the war, but what happened after they won the war, they hoped that everything will become better, but it was not. It became worse because the planned economy that was before only in North Vietnam was then also in South Vietnam. And the result was in the 90s, Vietnam was the poorest country in the world, even poorer than all African countries, poorer than Sierra Leone, or poorer than all African countries. But people in Vietnam are very smart. First, they tried to improve socialism. By the way, they did the same thing in Poland. They tried to make socialism to work it better. But of course, it didn't work because you can't improve socialism. It's not possible. It never works. Then they were very smart, and they understood that they had to allow private property, free market reforms, open their economy. They started in the end of the 80s. It took a couple of years, but today they call themselves still socialist with the Communist Party, but don't believe it. They are not. Of course, it's a one-party system, but in reality, capitalism won in Vietnam in the end. This is a little bit the irony of history, that they fought for communism, and in the end now they are capitalism won. And I've been there several times. I can guarantee you that it's harder to find a Marxist in a university in Vietnam than in the United States or in Europe. I had some lectures in Hanoi, for example, in the Foreign Trade University or in the most prestigious universities. They don't believe in Marxism, in socialism, maybe in with lip service, yes, or maybe some very old people, but they have very entrepreneurial thinking. They believe in capitalism. And what I really like on them, they love the United States. Can you imagine? They love the United States. I thought before I came there, because of the war, maybe they have, a negative opinion. I could understand it. There in the Vietnam War, there were 10 times more bombs on Vietnam than in the Second World War on Germany. So I could understand it. But it is not so. We had some Poles there in Vietnam, and they love America. And I met a young female entrepreneur, and she told me, of course, we remember the war, but my parents told me,
one of the things,
American, think like American, eat like American, then you will be successful. That's what they told them. And I had here a conversation with a Vietnamese ambassador in Germany, and I asked him, why is that? And he said, okay, we were in war with half of the members of the United States Security Council, with China, with Japan, with France, with the United States. If we would be angry with everyone, it would bring you to nothing. So we look not in the past, we look in the future. And this is the difference, for example, to African countries. They always blame colonialism for all their problems. What is a long time ago, maybe 100 years ago. And if you ask them, why have you such a terrible economic situation? Oh, it is because of colonialism. It is because of the fault is British. No, this is nonsense. It's their own fault. And this is the difference to Vietnam. They saw that the planned economy did not work. And then they started to implement a market economy system. And they are very successful. And 3 weeks ago, the new Index of Economic Freedom was published. This is an index every year. It's a rating of all countries in the world, how economically free they are. For the United States, it was the worst ranking since they started in 1995. The worst ranking.
What we see, though,
yes, sorry.
What we see today, though, is political leaders in America are not aligned with the average American. The average American wants to be left alone. They don't want government in the house, in the bedrooms. They like free enterprise. There are some youth in our country that lean towards socialism, but for the most part, I think COVID woke people up. Yeah. Do you see differences in your own government between what the leaders of the government are pushing and what the average German, and then I would also include European citizen wants the government to do in the way of free enterprise versus socialism?
Yes, of course. What you see from the United States, I think, and I've been there a lot of times in the last years in the United States, I had now, I think, 100 interviews with great people like you from this great radio stations there. And I saw a lot of people who embrace free market economy and entrepreneurship. And in Europe, it depends a little bit, but of course now we had great, huge sympathies, especially for the Green Party, but only as long as they were in the opposition. Now, when they are in the government, the people see what it means. They promise everything. They promise for us a green economic miracle. This was what they promised. They had big posters in the elections. Wait for the green economic miracle. But what happened in reality is that we have now the worst economy in Europe with a growth rate of 0.1 is the prediction. So people understand now. And the other thing, yes, exactly what you said. They want to tell us what to do, what we have to eat, and what car we should drive, or the best way to drive no car at all, only using bicycles, not to fly in vacation. And this is, all this leftist ideology. If someone want to drive a bicycle or an electric vehicle, I have no problem. He should do it. If you don't want to fly anywhere, I have no problem with this. But don't tell other people all over the time what they have to do. This is the crazy. Their crazy idea.
Let's stay on that point for a second. One of the successes of I guess you'd call it the pro-socialist, has been somehow to portray that capitalism is bad for the environment. And yet, with every concrete example that we can look at, whether it was in Russia, what they did to their own environment under a communist regime. In Germany, I think there's a prime example. When the Germany's finally reunited after the wall fell, I think the government from Bonn, moved to Berlin, of course, was shocked to find the environmental challenges that had occurred in East Germany. So why does somehow or other the green folks still able to portray as socialism as good for the environment, as opposed to capitalism, which they claim is bad for the environment, when all the facts show precisely the reverse?
So first of all, maybe I want to say congratulations. I met few people who know so much about it, and you're absolutely right. And I have some facts and figures to confirm what you said. In Germany, we had this experiment with socialism in East Germany and with capitalism in West Germany. And if we compare, for example, CO2 emissions, they were 3 times higher adjusted to GDP in East Germany than in West Germany, 3 times higher. And with other airborne pollutants, for example, sulfur dioxide, were 10 times higher in East Germany than in West Germany. And yes, you mentioned the Soviet Union, Russia. There was never in the world, in the history, such a great destruction of the environment that was there. But a lot of people don't know it. It's good that you mentioned. And yes, the leftists, they want to tell us today, we have to implement a planned economy because of climate change and because of environmental problems. But a planned economy never solved any problem in the last 100 years, never made the life of people easier, never made a higher standard of living, and especially never solved any environmental problems. On the contrary, they caused a lot of environmental problems. And you can see it, I mentioned before, the Index of Economic Freedom by the Heritage Foundation. You can get it for free on the internet. And they compared the standard of economic freedom in a country with an environmental performance index from the Yale University. And the result was the countries that were more economically free have much higher and better environmental standards than the countries that are economically suppressed. So it's absolutely correct. And you ask, why do people not understand it? There's one reason. They don't know anything about history. I saw only in the few remarks that you made here that you are well educated, and compliment again that you know a lot about history. But most people do not know. They know nothing because the teachers in the universities, they don't tell these things to the students, and they tell them all over the day about the evils of capitalism, but nothing about the reality of socialism. And I will give you one example. I spoke about all these lectures I had in the last 20 months in 30 countries all over the world. And in every lecture, I asked one question, the same question I asked, have you heard at school or at university about the biggest socialist experiment in history? This was Mao Zedong's so-called Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 1962. 45 million people died. 45 million people died. I have a chapter in another book from me, The Power of Capitalism. It starts with this biggest socialist experiment. I can recommend to everyone, read The Power of Capitalism. You have it there. And I asked everyone, have you heard about this at school? And wherever I talk, whether it's in Asia, in Latin America, in the United States, or in Europe, only very few people raised their hand. Maybe 5%, sometimes no one, but never more than 5%. They haven't heard about it. And this is the reason why I write my books about history, because socialists, they love to discuss about theory. They compare the reality of capitalism with their ideology, with their utopia. What is, of course, not fair. It is the same if I would compare your marriage with your wife with a romantic love novel where they kiss every morning and it's all about harmony. And then maybe your wife starts to read this and say, hey, let's divorce. It's not like it is in this book. You would say, hey, it's crazy. You can't compare our marriage with a book. But this is what socialists do. And I refuse to do it. I don't discuss about theory. I study history. This is what I did. I wrote now, this is my book number 29 now, How Nations Escape Poverty. It's about history. And I compare, for example, Vietnam in socialist times, Vietnam today. Poland in socialist times, Poland today. Even for China, it's true. I mentioned this where 45 million people died in the end of the 50s, but even in 1981, after the death of Mao Zedong, 88% of people in China lived in extreme poverty. But then Deng Xiaoping started with economic reforms. His slogan was, let some people become rich. Let's allow private property. And he did free market reforms. And the result is the number of people in China who live in poverty decreased from 88 to 1%. But the stupid thing is now that this Xi Jinping goes in the wrong opposite direction now. People forget after time why they became successful. The same with the United States. Why I admire the United States. I love the United States because for me, it's the greatest country ever. But why is that? It's only because two reasons for me. First, capitalism. And the other thing, I call it the American spirit. Believe in yourself. Think positive. Don't blame other people for your setbacks or for your failures. These are two things, the capital system and this positive, yes, I can attitude. What allowed it to people from like Arnold Schwarzenegger, who came from Austria, from a poor family, and to become the biggest bodybuilder in the world and to become a superstar in Hollywood and even governor of California. This is the American spirit. And now I think the problem is today this so-called woke people in the United States, they want to destroy the American spirit. They tell everyone you're a victim. You're a victim of capitalism. You're a victim of racism. You're a victim of whatever. And this is crazy. I tell you about someone else who I admire. This is Ray Charles. And Ray Charles, he was born in 1930, black, what was a much bigger issue in 1930 than today. And he was born in one of the poorest neighborhoods of his hometown. He never met his father. His mother died when she was 31 years old. He became blind when he was 7 years old. But he became the most successful male singer in history. He earned hundreds of millions and he became famous and everything what you want as a man. And he had this positive American spirit. And there are a lot of these stories. So I have another book. The title is unbreakable spirit. It's even about successful disabled people like Ray Charles, or you can mention Stevie Wonder, or I spoke with another American, Eric Weinmeier. He is blind and he climbed to Mount Everest. These kind of people, they should be role models. They never felt themselves like a victim. And if you have put together these two ingredients, capitalism and what I call the American spirit, the spirit of Ronald Reagan's time, yes, then every country will be successful. But if you put together socialism, planned economy, and victimhood mentality, you have no future.
Yeah, it has been a fascinating discussion. We have to have you on again very soon. In the interim, while you're waiting for our next interview with Rainer, go out and buy his books. His latest, of course, is How Nations Escape Poverty, Vietnam, Poland, and the Origins of Prosperity. Until our next conversation, farewell.
Thank you. I look very much forward. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Bye.
It was a great discussion. And again, I think the point that people are not studying history, the facts as opposed to theory, that is a real factor in, I think, every problem we're facing today. I believe we have our next guest already. If we have, okay, we have a bit of problem getting him online. The comparisons that we were discussing, whether it's the combination, the comparing East Germany and West Germany, or today, let's take a look at North Korea and South Korea, which I think is a fascinating parallel. South Korea has now become one of the most prosperous nations on earth, a great place to live. It's exporting its products all over the world. And then you have North Korea, where every year they come right up to the razor's edge of complete poverty, of complete starvation. You compare those two, then you compare East Germany and West Germany, you compare the old Iron Curtain countries against the Western European countries. The examples are there, they're clear, they're evident. And yet we see this impulse on the part of so many on the progressive side to go to socialism, a proven failure, over capitalism, a proven success. Daria, I know we didn't have a chance to get to your final question or your final point with Rainer. What did you want to say?
Well, I'm just really looking at Germany and seeing the problems that they're having with immigration, with what's going on in Ukraine. And I was really kind of curious to hear from Dr. Zitelmann whether, with the aging population that we have in the world today, with that demographic, with what would be the problems that they're going to be facing. So I hope we'll have him back on again soon to talk about some of that.
Yeah, it was a great discussion. Let's go to our next guest. Lee Habib is the creator and host of Our American Stories, a podcast and weekly syndicated radio show. Lee, welcome back to the program. Hope we didn't scare him away. Lee, welcome. Can you hear us?
I can.
There you go. How are you doing?
Good.
Tell us a bit about, you have talk a lot about history. Have Americans lost their sense of history?
Well, I think they haven't been, history hasn't been shared with them. So in this respect, they've lost something they were never given. It's hard to lose something that you were never given. So I think what's happened is, we just did a story with David McCullough from the National Archives before he died. And we're able to use it because it's the National Archives. And he said something interesting because he was talking about his story, why he believed that history mattered. And he said something interesting. He said, you can't love something you don't know. And what he worried is that people wouldn't know the story of America, not because of any of our faults particularly, but the education system had failed us. And in the end, he did admit that there was a day when Americans taught each other the story of America. And at a minimum, he was demanding that around breakfast tables, dinner tables, on Sundays, just like Christians or Jews or people of faith would teach their own kids their faith and not just leave it to the church or the synagogue or the mosque, we have to teach ourselves our own story, not just our country's story, but let's face it, we should be sharing our family story. Where did Grandpa come from, Dad? Well, here's where Grandpa came from, and here's why he left that country. So I think in large measure, at least on the conservative side, we've been I can only call us, let's just say negligent, grossly negligent, blaming the schools, but in the end acting like victims, as if there was no role we could have played. For instance, I can't tell you how many times I'll hear a conservative family, a patriarch or a matriarch say, oh, my kid wants to be a teacher. And they're very disappointed. And I'm going, oh my goodness, you should be pleased that your kid wants to be a teacher. And if they're not quite making the money they need to like own or buy a house, help them, because they're performing an important function and there's a market failure. Capitalism sometimes has market failures. It's not perfect. And the main and fundamental market failure of capitalism is this thing called teaching. It doesn't pay enough, but we're allowed to supplement that income of a family member who might want to teach. We want to hold that as an exalted position as conservatives. My friend Bill Bennett used to always tell me, in every Catholic family, one kid had to be a priest. And that kid was the highest, he was held in the highest esteem in that Catholic family. And how smart, right? And that vow of poverty that priest took, well, the family was always kicking some money back to the seminary student, right? Because it should not be a punishment to want to teach history. My dad, I say this because my dad was not only a history teacher and a department chair of history, but ended up becoming a superintendent of schools. And he could have made a lot more money. He loved what he did, but he always saw liberals seeing this as a great cause and sending their kids into education, while conservatives saw it as, how could you waste your life teaching? So there's something fundamental about us that has not taken this seriously. The leftists didn't steal our schools. We gave them to them and our tax.
Great point. Daria.
Lee, one of the things it seems to me is that we need a cultural change to actually occur in the country. We are a relatively new nation. We are a very forward-looking nation, near future orientation. We don't have that long history that China has or Western Europe has, where we've really relied on the glory of the past. We're looking at what we can build today, what we can build tomorrow. Sales are based on your quota for this quarter, what you can do in the future, not based on how well you did in the past. So do you think that we actually, in order to accomplish what you're talking about, need to reorient ourselves toward looking at what went on in the past, the good, the bad, the ugly, so to speak?
Well, I think it's fundamental. I don't know how I could raise my own family and not tell them about their family. Where did dad come from? Not giving a kid a cultural root. If you're raising your kid as a Christian, I can't imagine not reading the Bible together. And if the kid thinks it's a little boring, well, that's too bad. And try and make it more exciting. Learning history, if you teach it poorly, it's boring. If you teach it well, it's thrilling. So let's give them the materials, and there's never been more material available online. There's curriculum all over the place that we can pull from. There's material out there that I could have never seen as a kid. I couldn't have seen and heard David McCullough. Now, though he's dead, I can listen to him. Hillsdale College has courses. There's material everywhere. I think what we have to do is let our children know, and frankly, let ourselves know that the past is prologue. And in fact, we're still fighting so many of the fights we're fighting today, the rural America versus city America. That fight was happening in 1776, right? So, the anti-federalists and federalists are going at it. When Jefferson finally became president, he wanted to kill the Federalists. And though Jefferson hated executive power, guess what he does? He signs a deal with the French for the purchase of the Louisiana Territory, a $15 million land deal that Jefferson, the old Jefferson, would have eschewed and mocked as the monarchy expanding the nation. But what he wanted was more rural voters. He wanted to expand the rural parts of this country because there was a war between the big cities and the small towns, between the big states and the small states. Does that sound familiar? We're still having the same fights, and we've survived.
So, Lee, do you think some of this ignorance of history is based on the fact that our educators, many of them, and our leaders are actually trying to destroy some of the values that we have traditionally held in this country, some of the strong points in this country, like, for instance, the extended family, the sense of community, the sense of individual responsibility, and then change it to a more collectivist type of mentality where the state is allowed to fill in where private sector or individuals excelled but in the past?
Well, look, I think part of it is political. I mean, part of it is the states and the state power, central power, trying to move in on us. But again, much of this is territory we've surrendered, right? I mean, one thing we know is as countries get richer, families get smaller, right? And that's a consequence of materialism. That's a consequence of the very things that capitalism provides, which is lots of wealth. Well, it also provides for a shrinkage of families because we don't need as many kids. You know, when we were farmers, we needed 6 kids, 8 kids, 10 kids. There was great utility value. So even the conservative families, I know many of them are smaller. So I think we have to get like almost re-engineer what we think is important in our lives. If my daughter would say, Dad, I want 6 kids, I shouldn't roll my eyes and tell her how hard that is or how expensive that is, or how impractical that is, right? Because more kids is more love, and she'll figure it out, and she's got a family that will help. So I think a lot of this is not just left versus right stuff. By the way, I think that's serious, but I also think it's up versus down stuff. I mean, I think there's spiritual battles going on in the country, and I think it's materialism versus God. And this is something Huxley warned about. We know what Orwell warned about, but Huxley warned that we would become the type of people who didn't need book banners or censors because we were so busy pursuing our pleasures that we weren't going to bother to want to read a book. And so these are the things that I always have worried about with capitalism, and I love capitalism. But even Solzhenitsyn warned, capitalism isn't perfect either. And when money becomes your God, when the markets become your God, your kids will sniff that out, right? They'll figure out that money's more important than them. And then we've become a possible destructive ism too. Not as bad as communism, not as bad as socialism, better than both. But still, capitalism has a defect. And read that Solzhenitsyn speech in 1984. We're about to do it. Everybody thought he was going to come to America and rip communism. But that was easy. It's obvious to critique communism. But what we're not doing is properly critiquing what can happen when we put money and the markets as our God. And
yeah, going back to your point on history, just a fascinating personal story. I had a young employee who was made an offhand comment around our lunch table at the office that America's lucky because we've always been so rich and everything's always been so easy. And I gave her a copy of David McCullough's 1776.
Yep.
And she came back the next day almost with tears in her eyes about how Revolutionary War soldiers marching towards Valley Forge with no shoes, no warm clothes. And she goes, I never realized what a struggle it was to form this country. And that lack of a sense of history, which our educational system has been totally negligent about, and indeed, families at times have been negligent about too, is such an important factor in how we've gotten to the point where we are today, where all of our successes, all of our values are being called into question. And I'm so thrilled the way you portray it, that it's not something that the left took, it's something that we gave to them, and how important it is to take it back.
Well, you know, my dad always taught me, if you don't own a problem, you'll never solve a problem. Don't be a victim. And I'm telling you, I've started to sense a great sense of victimology in conservatives, and I find it odious. When I start to hear, oh, we'll never get out of this. Oh, it's never been so bad before. We just did a story on Lincoln's last and best and worst day. You know, he was murdered on Good Friday. He was murdered on the same day that Christ was murdered, right? And he was murdered and martyred on the day that was the best day of his life, just the day before, and even most of that day. Because the Civil War had ended, and there was a huge celebration in Washington, D.C. the night before. And then he wakes up and he gives parting hugs and kudos to the generals. Grant is there, his son's there. He takes a carriage ride with his wife. He goes to see a comedy, American Cousin, that night, and there's John Wilkes Booth. And by the way, representing a large faction of Southerners with no mask on, deliberately goes into the booth and shoots Lincoln in public, It was called by James Swanson, the great historian, a performance assassination because he didn't try and hide his identity. And everybody knew who Booth was. He jumped onto the stage for a performance that he staged. And he said, Sic semper tyrannis, the South is avenged, and was hoping to go back south a conquering hero. So when I hear the words, it's never been more divided, the country, or we've never faced such hard times, the reason Lincoln had been so gloomy is he lost his son Willie in the White House, and 600,000 souls were on his mind. The loss of 600,000 Americans out of a nation of 25 million. And so we can get through these things. But boy, when you get people to read these things, they realize the inheritance they have is not an entitlement. And then we produce grateful citizens instead of entitled citizens. This is the central reason to tell stories. It produces reams of gratitude. Reams.
And indeed, the gloom of the 60s with the Vietnam War, with racial division, the kind of dispirited of the mid-70s under the Jimmy Carter malaise administration, how that in a matter of a year or two turned into the optimism of the Reagan administration. And we look at what we have today. And I believe a change in administration in Washington can certainly turn the country around. And again, to your point, the doom and gloom, oh, it's never going to solve, we're never going to get better, we're on our final descent, that could turn on a dime. I live in New York City. And in the start of the 90s, New York City was frankly in the garbage can. Crime was rampant. The city was impoverished. They called it the city that could never be governed. 2 years into the Giuliani administration, all of a sudden, New York was the greatest city on the planet, a city with an unbounded future. And of course, now we're going back to the Dinkin type days of the early 1990s. But that vote at the ballot box can change the country's fortunes overnight. And you're absolutely right to portray that conservatives have no right to do this doom and gloom nonsense. They just destroy their own cause when they do that.
And it's voter suppression. I mean, we're actually suppressing our own vote. Because if we're saying it's hopeless, then why bother? And then we're sounding like the nihilist we're competing against. But we're not nihilists. And we believe in hope and future. And for anybody who's a Christian or a Bible-believing Christian or a Torah-believing Jew or a believing Muslim who believes in a God, then, oh my goodness, you should be hopeful and you should love this country because of its religious tolerance and its religious freedom. And that's still here and alive. People from every walk of life come here for that reason still, to practice their faith, unencumbered.
How much do you think social media has impacted the doom and gloom that we see today? It seems like it's pervasive in the media.
Look, I think it's part of it, but to Frank's point, it was terrible in the late 70s too, because, you know, in some respects, America had hit this cul-de-sac based on policy and also based on sort of Americans adopting the woe. And then in comes a guy who says, you know, it doesn't have to be this way. And a lot of Americans being sick and tired of being sick and tired. Like in 76, when Reagan ran, remember, he lost. He wasn't ready because the nation wasn't ready. The nation was ready in 1980. And I was 18 at the time, 19, and 61% of the youth vote, under 21, voted for Reagan. The New York Times could not believe it. Why are these young kids voting for the old conservative? Well, because we'd seen the excesses of the Woodstock generation. We didn't want to call our parents by their first name. We didn't want to have sex in the basement with the parent watching. There were families that said, oh, you can sleep with my daughter. Don't worry about your parents. You can sleep with my daughter in our house. It was weird. No, do drugs in our house. You can drink in our house. Oh, and that American flag, let's burn it and let's spit on our soldiers and all cops are pigs. I mean, remember, that was what came out. Look, some good things came out of the 60s, right? Because there were some good things that came out of the 60s. But boy, there were a lot of bad things. And so my generation, watching the generation before us, went, nah, we don't want to be a part of Team Woodstock. We'll take some of your music, but we're on to Team Reagan. People couldn't believe it.
You know, Lee, I just have to make a quick comment. I was a delegate to the Republican National Convention in 1976 as a sophomore in college in Kansas City, and I was a delegate for Reagan. And I do remember that feeling of positiveness and all the young people. It felt like we had a hero in front of us, somebody who could turn things around, and it did make a difference.
No
I
doubt.
know we've
And-
got to go pretty soon, Frank, but I had to mention that one because
Well, and
I'm
it's
not
urgent.
vegan.
It's an urgent thing because from the leadership comes our hope and our attitude, right? And by the way, David McCullough said something really interesting about attitudes. He said they can't be taught, they have to be caught. And I think that's true. And we catch them through this storytelling. We catch them through this storytelling.
Fantastic. Lee, it's been a great conversation. Let's do it again soon.
Anytime. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in today.
Welcome our newest radio affiliate in Washington, D.C. at 96.7 FM. Watch us on Roku, public broadcast stations, and on the AM/FM 24/7 network. Tell Alexa to open the network and play our program. You can also access the show on our website at usagovpolicy.com. Join us again next week. We're sponsored by the New York Analysis of Policy and Government, a division of the American Analysis of News and Media, Inc., and the Institute for American Politics. Email us at truthinradio@gmail.com.
Our producer is the amazing Abigail White, and our director is the brilliant Jeff Hansen.